What would convince me that God exists? One of the most important questions I get is, what would convince you that God exists? I actually think that's a fantastic question. Not because it's easy to answer, but because it forces me to explain my standard of evidence. If I'm going to reject a claim as extraordinary as the existence of God, then I should also be able to explain what kind of evidence would change my mind. Before I answer that, though, I think it's worth mentioning something. In conversations with Muslims, this question is rarely the end of the discussion. It's usually the first step in a much larger argument. The idea is something like this. First establish that God exists. Then establish that there's only one God. Then establish that this God revealed himself to humanity. Then establish that he revealed himself through Muhammad. Then establish that the Quran is his revelation. That's a perfectly legitimate way to build a case, but it's important to recognize that these are separate claims. Even if I became convinced tomorrow that some kind of creator exists, that wouldn't automatically tell me anything about Islam. It wouldn't tell me that the creator is one, that the creator is all-powerful, all-merciful, or that Muhammad is his messenger. Those would all require additional evidence. So let's start with the first question. Do I currently believe a God exists? No. More accurately, I don't think the evidence I've encountered is strong enough to justify that belief. One of the biggest reasons is what philosophers call divine hiddenness. If an all-knowing God created humanity and wanted us to know him, or even intended to judge us based on our response to him, I would expect much clearer communication than we actually observe. Instead, we see thousands of religions, countless denominations, conflicting revelations, sincere believers, sincere skeptics, and billions of people born into different faiths, depending largely on where and when they happen to be born. That doesn't look like what I would expect if an all-powerful God wanted his existence to be obvious. The second reason is suffering. Now, I'm not saying that any amount of suffering disproves God. I can imagine a world where some suffering exists because it helps develop courage, compassion, resilience, and responsibility. But our world doesn't contain just a little suffering. It contains children dying from cancer, people born with devastating genetic diseases, people struggling with severe depression, people living on the streets, victims of war, victims of abuse, natural disasters, famine, loneliness. The list goes on and on. If I were an all-powerful and perfectly compassionate being, I have a hard time understanding why I would create a world with this much suffering. Could there be reasons beyond my understanding? Maybe. But from where I stand today, the amount and intensity of suffering count against the existence of a perfectly good and all-powerful God. Now here's the important part. None of this means I think belief in God is impossible. Far from it. I can imagine evidence that would completely change my mind. So what would convince me? The evidence would have to be direct, public, and repeatable. By direct, I mean it comes from God himself. Not an ancient book, not a prophet, not someone else's testimony, not a dream, not a feeling. I mean direct interaction. Imagine a being appears before me. We have a conversation. I ask questions. It answers intelligently. It demonstrates knowledge that no human being could possibly possess. That's direct. Second, it should be public. If God wants humanity to know he exists, why should the evidence depend on stories from thousands of years ago or on private religious experiences? Why not provide evidence that everyone can witness? Imagine every being on earth simultaneously experiences the same event. Everyone hears the same message in their own language. Everyone can interact with the same being. No ambiguity. No competing interpretations. Third, it should be repeatable. If someone claims a miracle happened once 2,000 years ago, I have no way of verifying that. But if God performs miracles today, under observation, over and over again, that's a completely different kind of evidence. Imagine amputated limbs instantly growing back. Not once, thousands of times. Doctors examine every patient. Scientists study every case. No known biological process can explain it. Or imagine God creates a living being from ordinary matter in front of millions of witnesses, or answers questions that nobody else could possibly know. That's the kind of evidence that would genuinely change my mind. And if I experienced something like that, yes, I would believe God exists. Absolutely. Now, some people respond by saying, but then life wouldn't be a test. I've never found that convincing, because I don't think belief itself is the best test. Imagine a teacher. The teacher walks into the classroom, introduces themselves, explains the rules, hands out the exam, then evaluates the students based on how they behave and how well they perform. That seems like a fair test. Now imagine a different scenario. The teacher never appears. Hundreds of students all claim to represent the teacher. They contradict each other. They all insist they're the authentic representative. At the end of the semester, the invisible teacher punishes students because they believe the wrong representative. That doesn't strike me as a fair test. If I were designing a test for humanity, I wouldn't hide my own existence. I would make my existence unmistakably clear. Then I would judge people based on their character, how they treated others, whether they showed compassion, whether they chose honesty over deceit, whether they helped the vulnerable instead of exploiting them. Those seem like much better tests than asking people to navigate thousands of competing religious claims with limited and ambiguous evidence. Now, let me make one final point. Even if tomorrow I became convinced that God exists, the conversation wouldn't be over. I'd still have questions. Is this being morally good? Does this being deserve worship? Has this being actually communicated with humanity? If so, through whom? Those are separate questions. But before I can seriously investigate any prophet or any religion, I first need sufficient reason to believe that the speaker exists. So if you ask me what would convince me that God exists, my answer is simple. Not blind faith, not tradition, not stories, not emotions. Direct, public, repeatable evidence. If that evidence appeared tomorrow, I would change my mind tomorrow. Until then, I'm simply trying to believe as closely as I can to where I think the evidence leads.